The Appalachian wilderness stretched out like an ancient, unbroken ocean of trees. Rolling hills shrouded in layers of mist that clung stubbornly to the earth. Pines and oaks loomed like sentinels, their jagged silhouettes stark against a gray sky that seemed perpetually on the verge of rain. The air was heavy with the scent of damp moss and decaying leaves, a fragrance that spoke of time slowed to a crawl, as if the region itself refused to yield to the passage of centuries. Eleanor Hart tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her car rumbling along the uneven gravel road leading into the heart of the valley. She had driven for hours, leaving behind the comforts of paved highways and bustling towns. Here, the modern world felt like a distant dream, swallowed by the isolation of the hollers. As a folklorist, she was no stranger to remote places or the peculiarities of small-town life. Yet something about the Appalachian wilderness unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite name. Her gaze flicked to the GPS mounted on her dashboard. The signal had vanished half an hour ago, leaving her to rely on printed directions scrawled in her own hurried handwriting. As the road dipped into a shadowy grove, she slowed the car, glancing at the dense forest pressing in on both sides. The trees whispered to each other, their branches swaying despite the stillness of the air. It wasn't the first time she had noticed the peculiar quiet. No birdsong, no chirping insects, just the low hum of her engine and the soft crunch of tires on gravel. Eleanor's destination was the town of Meadow Hollow, a place so small it barely warranted a dot on the map. She had first heard about it while researching Appalachian folklore at her university in Chicago. The stories that came out of Meadow Hollow were unlike anything she had encountered before. A patchwork of cryptid sightings, ghostly apparitions, and a pervasive sense of unease that seemed to cling to the very soil. Among the most enigmatic tales was that of the Hollow, a stretch of forest so steeped in dread that even the locals refused to venture near it. Her academic curiosity had been piqued, and she had spent months securing grants and permissions to investigate the area. Yet now, as she approached the town, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was intruding on something that didn't want to be found. The first signs of Meadow Hollow came into view, a rusted metal sign, its paint peeling to reveal the faint outline of the town's name, followed by a cluster of weathered houses huddled together like conspirators. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, the scent of burning wood mingling with the dampness of the air. Eleanor pulled into what appeared to be the town's main street, if the single row of buildings could be called that. A general store, a diner, and a tiny post office formed the bulk of Meadow Hollow's commerce. She parked in front of the diner, her arrival drawing the attention of a group of men sitting on a bench outside. They looked up from their conversation, their expressions guarded. Eleanor stepped out of the car, the crunch of her boots on gravel loud in the stillness. "Afternoon," she called, offering a polite smile. The men exchanged glances, then nodded in unison, their eyes lingering on her with thinly veiled suspicion. One of them, a wiry man with a face like a weathered oak, tipped his hat. "Passing through?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Not exactly," Eleanor replied, adjusting the strap of her satchel. "I'm here to do some research, folklore mostly." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, and Eleanor felt the weight of the other's stares. "Folklore?" he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with a hint of disdain. "Well, you won't find much good in digging up old stories. Some things are best left alone." "Maybe," Eleanor said, undeterred, "but I'd still like to hear them." The man shrugged, leaning back on the bench. "Suit yourself. Just be careful where you go poking around. Not everything out here takes kindly to strangers." The comment hung in the air, heavy with implication. Eleanor nodded, murmuring her thanks, and stepped into the diner. As the door swung shut behind her, she glanced over her shoulder. The men were still watching her, their faces unreadable. Inside, the warmth of the diner was a welcome contrast to the chill outside. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted her with a tight smile. "Coffee?" the waitress asked as Eleanor slid into a booth. "Please," Eleanor replied, setting her notebook on the table. "And maybe some advice if you have it." I'm looking into the stories about the Hollow. The waitress froze mid-step, her smile faltering. The Hollow? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor nodded. That's right. What can you tell me about it? The waitress hesitated, then set the coffee cup down with a deliberate slowness. Not much, she said, her tone clipped. Just that you're better off staying away. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor to sit alone with her coffee, the weight of unspoken warnings pressing down on her like a gathering storm. The library of Meadow Hollow wasn't much more than a single room attached to the town hall, but its shelves were packed with old books, local records, and weathered binders filled with clippings from the regional paper. Eleanor spent her first full day in town sifting through them, the smell of aged paper and dust sharp in the still air. Though modest in size, the collection was a folklorist's dream, evidence of a community with a deep connection to its own stories. The deeper she dug, the more she unearthed tales that sent shivers racing down her spine. By the time the sun set that evening, Eleanor had filled half a notebook with notes. The most prominent figures in the folklore were chillingly vivid, each steeped in terror and mystery. The Mothman, described as a towering figure with glowing red eyes and massive, insect-like wings, was said to appear as an omen of tragedy. Though most sightings were reported farther north, there were whispered accounts from Meadow Hollow, a farmer swearing he saw it perched atop his barn just hours before his livestock fell ill, and an old woman recounting how it had flown over the church on the night lightning struck the steeple. Then there was the Wampus Cat, a half-human, half-feline creature prowling the darkest stretches of the woods. Some claimed it was a witch cursed to roam the forests after spying on a sacred tribal ritual. Others swore it was an ancient spirit, punishing the guilty and devouring the lost. One particularly gruesome story involved a hunter who'd ventured into the holler, his mangled body later found with claw marks slashed deep into the trees nearby. And, of course, the Bell Witch, or at least her echo. The infamous haunting was tied to Tennessee, but there were unsettling stories of her shadow lingering in the region. A preacher's journal from the early 1800s described a ghostly voice singing hymns at night outside his cabin, and a schoolteacher in the 1930s wrote about seeing a pale figure standing at the edge of a creek, vanishing when approached. Eleanor flipped back through her notes, a pattern forming. These weren't isolated stories but threads of a tapestry, all pointing toward a singular place. The stretch of woods the locals called the Hollow. The mere mention of it seemed to evoke dread, even in the records. No accounts spoke of entering it and returning unscathed. The last note she wrote before closing her notebook for the night read, "The Hollow is where the stories live, and maybe where they die." The next morning, Eleanor decided to leave the safety of the written word and seek out the people who had lived these stories. It was clear that the library only scratched the surface. Her first lead was Caleb. She found him at the edge of town, unloading firewood from the bed of a beat-up truck. He was a wiry man in his early 40s, his sun-weathered face framed by a shaggy beard. Dressed in a flannel shirt and worn boots, he moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who spent more time in the woods than around people. "Caleb?" Eleanor asked, stepping carefully over the uneven ground. He glanced up, his eyes narrowing. "Who's a skin?" "Eleanor Hart. I'm a folklorist." She extended a hand, but he didn't take it. "I'm here researching the stories of Meadow Hollow, and I heard you might have some insight." Caleb let out a low chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Stories, huh? Is that what they told you? They mentioned you've spent a lot of time in the woods, maybe seen things most people haven't." He studied her for a long moment before nodding toward a split log nearby. "Sit." Eleanor obeyed, flipping open her notebook as Caleb lit a cigarette. For a while, he said nothing, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of his boots as he paced. "You want to hear about the woods?" he finally asked. "About what I've seen? That's why I'm here." His eyes darkened. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." What followed was a story that left Eleanor breathless. Caleb described hunting in the Hollow as a younger man, following the faint call of an injured deer deeper than he'd ever gone before. He spoke of a sudden silence falling over the forest, the air growing cold despite the summer heat. Then he saw it, a flickering light weaving through the trees like a will-o'-the-wisp. But when he followed, the light turned into something else. A figure with no face, its body shifting like smoke, reaching out toward him. "I ran," Caleb said, his voice low. "Didn't stop till I hit the road. Haven't gone back since. And I won't." Later that afternoon, Eleanor paid a visit to Maggie's house. The elderly woman had been described as the town's unofficial historian, though most locals called her something closer to a seer. Her home, perched at the edge of town, was surrounded by a chaotic garden of herbs and wildflowers. Maggie herself was small and hunched, her bright eyes gleaming with a sharpness that belied her age. "Folklore, is it?" Maggie said, settling into her rocking chair. "That's what they're calling it these days." Eleanor smiled. "I've heard you know more than most." Maggie waved her hand dismissively. "What I know ain't for books or tourists, honey. It's for keeping people alive." Undeterred, Eleanor pressed on. "What about the Hollow?" Caleb mentioned. Maggie's face hardened. "The Hollow's cursed. Always has been, always will be. You'd do well to leave it alone." "Cursed how? Does it matter?" Maggie snapped, her voice sharp. But after a moment, she sighed, her gaze drifting toward the window. "There's something there, something old. It don't like strangers, and it don't forgive trespassers. You want to know what happened to the McAllisters? Or do you want to keep your pretty little notebook clean?" Eleanor leaned forward. "Who were the McAllisters?" Maggie hesitated, then began a story about a family who had once lived near the Hollow Ridge. They'd vanished one by one over the course of a year, leaving only their youngest, a boy found wandering the woods, unable to speak. The house they'd lived in had burned to the ground a month later, the cause never determined. The final piece of Eleanor's puzzle came in the form of Josiah. She met him at the town's single bar, a dimly lit space with peeling wallpaper and a jukebox that hadn't worked in decades. Josiah was leaning against the bar, nursing a beer and scrolling through his phone. "Let me guess," he said as she approached. "You're the lady asking about the spooky woods. You've heard." "Small town," he replied with a smirk. "People talk." "Josiah Moore. I write for the Meadow Hollow Gazette. What's left of it, anyway." "Eleanor Hart," she said, sitting beside him. "I'm here to learn about—" "The Hollow, yeah," Josiah interrupted. "Look, I'm all for uncovering the truth, but you're chasing ghost stories. The locals love their tall tales, and you're eating them up." "What about Caleb and Maggie?" Eleanor asked. "They seemed convinced." Josiah snorted. "Caleb's paranoid, and Maggie's been telling those stories since before I was born. You want my advice? Write your article, make it spooky, and get out while you can." That night, Eleanor returned to her rented cabin, her mind spinning with everything she'd learned. Exhaustion weighed on her as she settled into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. In the early hours of the morning, a faint sound woke her, a soft creak, like footsteps on the porch. Sitting upright, she strained her ears, her pulse quickening. The footsteps stopped, but a low whisper seemed to drift through the air. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. A warning. The next morning, she found deep scratches carved into her front door, for lines jagged and deliberate. No animals she knew of could have done it. She stood frozen, the scratches seeming to pulse with menace in the pale morning light. For the first time since arriving in Meadow Hollow, Eleanor felt true fear creeping in. And for the first time, she began to wonder if the stories were more than just folklore. The following day, Eleanor couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her like a shadow. The scratches on her door were too precise to be random, too deliberate to dismiss. She snapped a photo of them with her phone, noting how the jagged lines seemed to shimmer slightly when caught in the morning light. The image unsettled her even more when viewed on the screen. The marks appeared deeper and darker than they had in person. Her first instinct was to show Caleb. He was the only person she'd met who might take her concerns seriously. However, when she stopped by his house on the outskirts of town, she was greeted only by silence. His truck was gone, and a note tacked to the door read, "Out hunting. Don't wait." Disheartened, she turned toward the library, thinking she might find more details in the local records. But even there, something felt off. The librarian, a wiry man with glasses that magnified his eyes to an unnerving degree, barely acknowledged her presence as she walked in. He shuffled between the shelves, muttering under his breath, his gaze darting toward her every so often. The air was stifling, heavy with an unspoken tension that made Eleanor's skin prickle. Despite the unease, she managed to find a trove of handwritten letters stored in a musty corner of the library. These letters, dating back to the late 19th century, were filled with accounts of strange happenings near the Hollow. One letter, written by a man named Samuel Wilkes in 1883, caught her attention. The script was shaky, as if written in haste, but the words were clear. The light came again last night, dancing like a lantern through the trees. I thought it might be a traveler in need, but when I called out, it flickered, and the woods fell silent. There was a coldness then, not of winter but of something deeper. I turned and ran, though I dare not say what followed me. The lantern is no man's light. It is the devil's trick, and it wants us in the dark. Eleanor read the passage 3 times, her pulse quickening with each repetition. The description mirrored Caleb's story almost exactly. The flickering light, the silence, the cold. Whatever haunted these woods had been there for generations, weaving its way into the fabric of the town's collective memory. She carefully copied the letter's contents into her notebook, feeling a chill run down her spine. As she packed up her things, she noticed the librarian watching her again. He stood half-hidden behind a shelf, his glasses catching the dim light, but his expression was unreadable. When their eyes met, he flinched and disappeared deeper into the stacks. Eleanor didn't linger. That evening, she sat at the small desk in her cabin, poring over her notes. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, but something was missing. Every story pointed to the Hollow as the epicenter of the town's fear, but no one had explained why. Even Maggie, with all her cryptic warnings, had only hinted at the danger. What was it about that place that scared people so deeply? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling outside. It wasn't the creak of footsteps this time, but something lighter, like leaves brushing against the cabin walls. She froze, listening intently. The sound circled the cabin, faint but persistent, as if something or someone was testing the boundaries. Eleanor stood, her breath catching in her throat, and moved toward the window. The moon was high, casting pale light over the clearing outside. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the skeletal branches of trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, a faint glow caught her eye. It was a light, flickering and uneven, like the flame of a lantern. She stared at it, her mind racing. Could be nothing, maybe a stray camper or a reflection of the moonlight. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The glow was too deliberate, too alive. It hovered for a moment, then began to drift slowly into the trees. Her curiosity battled with her fear. Every instinct told her to stay inside, lock the door, and wait for morning. But the pull of the unknown was too strong. Grabbing her flashlight and phone, she slipped on her boots and stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin. The light moved further into the woods, weaving through the trees like a phantom. Eleanor followed cautiously, keeping her distance. She knew she was being reckless. Caleb's and Samuel Wilkes's warnings echoed in her mind, but she couldn't stop herself. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself was resisting her advance. When she reached the tree line, the light paused, hovering just out of reach. Eleanor raised her flashlight, but the beam seemed to dissolve in the thick darkness, unable to penetrate more than a few feet. She took another step forward, her heart pounding in her chest, and the light vanished. The silence that followed was absolute. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just an oppressive, deafening stillness. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps as she scanned the woods, her flashlight darting from shadow to shadow. Then, faintly, she heard it, a whisper. It was soft, almost melodic, and entirely unintelligible. The sound sent a jolt of fear through her, but it also rooted her in place. She strained to hear, tilting her head toward the sound. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, but still, the words eluded her. And then, from behind her, came a low, guttural growl. Eleanor whirled around, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam caught a glimpse of movement, something dark and low to the ground, slipping between the trees. It was too fast to make out, but the impression of long limbs and sharp angles was enough to send her running. She stumbled back toward the cabin, her breaths ragged and her legs screaming in protest. The growl followed her, accompanied by the sound of snapping branches and something heavy crashing through the underbrush. She didn't dare look back. When she burst into the clearing, she slammed the cabin door shut behind her and locked it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the latch. She pressed her back against the door, her flashlight clattering to the floor. The silence outside was immediate, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. For several minutes, she stood frozen, her ears straining for any sign of pursuit. But there was nothing, no growls, no footsteps, no whispers, just the sound of her own heartbeat, thundering in her chest. It was only then that she realized she was still clutching her phone. Her fingers fumbled to open the camera app, and she aimed it toward the window, snapping a photo without thinking. When she finally worked up the courage to look, the image sent a fresh wave of terror through her. In the photo, faint but unmistakable, was the glow of the lantern. But this time it wasn't in the woods. It was right outside the cabin, hovering just beyond the window. Eleanor dropped the phone, her mind racing. The stories were real, every last one of them. And whatever haunted the hollow wasn't content to stay in the woods. She didn't sleep that night. How could she? Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the windows, sent her heart racing. She sat in the corner of the room with her back to the wall, her flashlight clutched tightly in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. The scratches on the door no longer seemed like a warning. They felt like a promise. As dawn broke, pale light filtering through the trees, Eleanor made a decision. She couldn't run, not yet. She had come to Meadow Hollow to uncover the truth. And now, more than ever, she needed to know what lay at the heart of the hollow. Eleanor spent the morning preparing for what she knew would be the most dangerous venture of her life. The truth about the hollow wasn't going to come to her cabin. It was out there, buried in the woods, waiting. Though her fear had kept her paralyzed the night before, daylight brought a faint clarity to her thoughts. She couldn't leave now, not with so many questions unanswered. Her first stop was Maggie's house. If anyone could provide her with some semblance of guidance, or even a warning worth heeding, it was the elderly woman whose stories felt more like fragmented truths than fables. Maggie was sitting on her porch, her hands deftly knotting what looked like small bundles of herbs tied together with twine. She barely looked up as Eleanor approached. "You've seen it now, haven't you?" Maggie asked, her voice sharp, as if she'd been expecting her. Eleanor froze. "The light," she said quietly. "It came last night." Maggie's hands stilled for the first time, her eyes meeting Eleanor's with an intensity that made her stomach churn. "And yet you're still here," Maggie muttered. "I figured you'd have packed up and run off like the others." "I need to know what it is," Eleanor said, stepping closer. "Why it's here, what it wants. It's not just folklore, is it? It's real." Maggie sighed, setting the bundle of herbs aside. "You've got a death wish, girl. Tell me what I'm dealing with," Eleanor pressed. "Please, I'm not leaving until I understand." For a moment, Maggie simply stared at her, as if weighing whether Eleanor deserved the answers she sought. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and began to speak. "The hollow is older than this town, older than the mountains themselves," she said. "The stories people tell are just shadows of the truth, passed down from one frightened soul to the next. That light you saw is what folks around here call the Lantern Man. Some say he's a spirit, maybe a man who was betrayed and murdered in the woods, his soul cursed to wander forever. Others think he's something older, something that was never human to begin with." Eleanor hung on every word, her pulse quickening. "And the growl? The creature I saw?" Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line. The hollow doesn't just have one thing lurking in it. The lantern man might be the one who draws people in, but there are other things out there waiting to take them. That growl you heard? That was one of them. Why does it draw people in? What does it want? No one knows for sure, Maggie said. Maybe it feeds on fear. Maybe it just likes to watch people lose themselves in the dark. All I know is no one who goes too far into the hollow ever comes back the same, if they come back at all. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. Has anyone ever survived it? Gone in and lived to tell the tale? Maggie hesitated. A few, but they're never right after. One man, Joseph Talley, made it out back in the 60s. Wandered into town days later, covered in scratches and babbling about lights and voices. He was never the same. Moved away a few years later, and no one ever heard from him again. Do you know where he went? Maggie shook her head. Doesn't matter. You won't find him, and even if you did, he wouldn't help you. He'd tell you the same thing I'm telling you now. Stay away. Eleanor thanked her, but left feeling no closer to the answers she needed. She couldn't shake the feeling that Maggie wasn't telling her everything. But there was no time to press further. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, and if she was going into the hollow, she needed to start soon. Her next stop was Josiah. Though his skepticism had irritated her before, she needed an extra set of eyes, and more importantly, someone who wasn't afraid to confront the danger head-on. She found him at the diner, sitting in his usual corner with a coffee in hand. "You again," he said, raising an eyebrow as she slid into the booth across from him. "I thought you'd be on your way back to wherever you came from by now." "I need your help," Eleanor said bluntly. Josiah laughed. "Help with what?" "Chasing ghosts." "I'm going into the hollow," she said, watching as his smirk faded. "And I could use someone who isn't afraid to face the truth." Josiah set his coffee down, leaning back in his chair. "You're serious? Dead serious?" He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed. "You really think there's something out there worth risking your life for?" "I know there is," she said. "And I think you do too. You just don't want to admit it." Josiah shook his head, but there was no mistaking the flicker of unease in his eyes. "You're crazy, you know that?" "Maybe," Eleanor said, "but you're coming with me anyway." Against all odds, he agreed. An hour later, they stood at the edge of the forest, their supplies packed and their nerves fraying. Eleanor carried a flashlight, her notebook, and a small pack of food and water. Josiah had brought a hunting knife and a camera, though his confidence seemed to waver with every passing minute. "Last chance to back out," he said, glancing at Eleanor. She shook her head. "Let's go." The woods swallowed them whole, the towering trees blotting out the sun and plunging them into an eerie twilight. The air was heavy, each step muffled by the thick carpet of leaves underfoot. They walked in silence, their eyes darting to every shadow and flicker of movement. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes, it was impossible to tell. Time felt warped in the hollow, stretching and compressing in equal measure. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Strange symbols were carved into the bark, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. "Do you hear that?" Josiah whispered, his voice trembling. Eleanor stopped, straining her ears. At first, she heard nothing, just the faint rustle of leaves. But then it came, a low, rhythmic hum, like a distant chant carried on the wind. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill racing down her spine. "We shouldn't be here," Josiah muttered, his grip tightening on the knife. Before Eleanor could respond, the light appeared. It was faint at first, barely visible through the dense trees. But as they watched, it grew brighter, its glow pulsating like a heartbeat. Eleanor felt an overwhelming urge to move toward it, her feet inching forward of their own accord. "Eleanor, stop," Josiah said, grabbing her arm. "That's it. That's the lantern man." She turned to him, her heart racing. "We have to see it. We have to know." Josiah shook his head, his face pale. "If we go any closer, we won't come back." But Eleanor was already moving, drawn toward the light like a moth to a flame. As they stepped closer, the forest fell silent. The hum grew louder, filling the air with an otherworldly vibration that seemed to seep into their very bones. The light hovered ahead, its form shifting and twisting, almost humanoid but never quite solid. And then, as they reached the edge of a small clearing, it turned toward them. The light wasn't a lantern. It wasn't even a man. It was something else entirely. Something ancient, its body a swirling mass of fire and shadow, its eyes like burning coals. It stared at them, its gaze piercing and unrelenting. And in that moment, Eleanor felt the weight of every story she'd ever heard. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The light surged forward, and the darkness closed in. The surge of light was overwhelming, swallowing everything in its path. Eleanor stumbled back, shielding her eyes, but the brightness burned through her closed lids. It wasn't just light. It was alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy that pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She could hear Josiah shouting, but his voice sounded distant, as if the light had created a barrier between them and the rest of the world. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light dimmed. It didn't vanish but receded, flickering like a flame in a strong wind. Eleanor lowered her hands cautiously, her vision blurred with spots. Josiah stood a few feet away, his knife drawn, his expression a mixture of terror and disbelief. The clearing around them had changed. Where before there had been moss-covered ground and the tangled roots of ancient trees, now there was bare, cracked earth, as if the light had scorched the life out of the land. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and something metallic, like blood. "Eleanor," Josiah said, his voice shaking, "we need to go. Now." She nodded, but her feet refused to move. Her eyes were locked on the center of the clearing, where the light hovered low to the ground, shifting and writhing like a living thing. And then she saw it, or thought she did. A figure within the light, indistinct and skeletal, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It wasn't human. Couldn't be. The figure raised an arm, or something that resembled an arm, and pointed toward them. The movement was slow, deliberate, and filled with an undeniable intent. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears as she realized it was beckoning them. "No," Josiah said firmly, stepping in front of her. "We're not going anywhere near that thing." Eleanor felt a strange pull in her chest, like an invisible thread tugging her forward. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body betrayed her, her feet inching toward the light. It was calling to her, not with words but with something deeper, a resonance that vibrated in her very bones. Josiah grabbed her arm and yanked her back. "Snap out of it," he shouted. "You can't go to it. Do you hear me?" The sharpness of his voice broke the spell. Eleanor stumbled back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The light flared, its glow intensifying, and the figure within it began to take a step forward. "Run," Josiah hissed. "Run." This time she obeyed. They turned and sprinted back into the woods, the underbrush tearing at their clothes and the branches clawing at their faces. The humming sound grew louder, chasing them, and Eleanor could feel the light behind her, growing brighter with every step. "Don't look back," Josiah shouted, his voice ragged. But she couldn't help herself. She glanced over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. The light was moving through the trees, not like something walking but like something flowing, an amorphous mass of fire and shadow that twisted and shifted unnaturally. And within it, the figure grew more defined. Its long limbs and hollow eyes burned into her memory. Ahead of her, Josiah let out a sharp cry. Eleanor turned back just in time to see him trip over a root and fall hard to the ground. He scrambled to get up, but the light was closing in, the humming now a deafening roar. "Go!" he yelled, waving her off. "Don't stop." But she didn't run. She couldn't. Instead, she turned and grabbed his arm, hauling him to his feet with a strength she didn't know she had. Together, they stumbled forward, the light so close now that Eleanor could feel its heat against her back. The edge of the forest came into view, a faint break in the trees where the clearing around the hollow ended. Eleanor pushed Josiah ahead of her, her lungs burning and her legs screaming in protest. The light flared one last time, so bright it lit up the forest like a second sun. And then, darkness. They burst out of the woods and into the open, collapsing onto the ground. The air was different here, cool and crisp, no longer heavy with smoke and dread. Eleanor rolled onto her back, staring up at the sky as her chest heaved. The light hadn't followed them out of the hollow. It had stopped at the tree line, as if bound to the shadows. Josiah sat up first, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "What the hell was that?" he rasped, his voice raw. Eleanor shook her head, unable to find the words. Her hands were trembling, and her mind was a jumbled mess of fear and disbelief. She looked back at the forest, half expecting to see the light still waiting there, but the trees were dark and silent. "Is it gone?" Josiah asked, following her gaze. "For now," she whispered, "but it's still in there." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of what they just experienced settling over them like a shroud. Eleanor couldn't stop replaying the image of the figure in the light, its hollow eyes and outstretched hand. It hadn't chased them to harm them, at least not directly. It had been calling to them, inviting them deeper into the hollow. She turned to Josiah. "You saw it, didn't you? The figure inside the light." He nodded slowly, his expression grim. "I saw it. What do you think it is?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," he said. "But I know one thing, it's not just a story." Eleanor nodded, her thoughts racing. The legends of the hollow were real, and they were far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But they weren't just stories. They were warnings, passed down by those who had seen the truth and lived to tell the tale. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "We need to go back." Josiah stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Are you insane? After what we just saw?" "We didn't finish," she said, her voice steady despite the fear still coursing through her. "Whatever that thing is, it's tied to the hollow. If we don't figure out why it's there, more people are going to get hurt or worse." Josiah hesitated, his jaw tightening. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "No," she said. "I'm not." He let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "You're going to get us killed." "Maybe," Eleanor admitted, "but at least we'll know the truth." Josiah didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told her he wasn't about to abandon her. Whatever lay ahead, they were in it together, and they both knew the hollow wasn't done with them yet. The next morning, the air in Meadow Hollow felt different, heavier somehow. The small town was quiet as Eleanor and Josiah sat in the diner, eating a meal they barely tasted. Both of them were still reeling from the previous night, their minds replaying the surreal and terrifying events in the woods. Eleanor's hand lingered on her coffee cup, the warmth grounding her as she stared out the window at the endless expanse of trees that surrounded the town. "We need a plan," she said finally, breaking the silence. Josiah looked up from his plate, his expression wary. "A plan for what?" "Getting ourselves killed faster." Eleanor ignored the jab. "We can't just walk into the hollow again blind. There's something about that light, it's not random. It lures people, but it also reacts to us. Last night, it could have caught us if it wanted to. It stopped at the tree line for a reason." Josiah leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming on the edge of the table. "You think it's intelligent? Like it knows what it's doing?" "I think it's more than that," Eleanor said. "I think it's purposeful. Every story I've read, every person I've talked to, it all points to the same thing. The Lantern Man, or whatever it is, wants something." "Like what?" Josiah asked, his voice rising slightly. "We don't even know what it is, let alone what it wants. For all we know, it just likes toying with people before it, I don't know, eats them or something." "Maybe," Eleanor admitted, "but I can't stop thinking about the figure in the light. It wasn't just mindless. It was trying to communicate." Josiah shook his head, running a hand over his face. "This is crazy. I should have stayed at the paper." "But you didn't," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "You came with me, and now you've seen it. You can't just pretend it didn't happen." Josiah opened his mouth to argue but stopped, his shoulders sagging. Fine. So, what's your plan? Eleanor pulled out her notebook, flipping to a page filled with hastily scribbled notes. We need to go deeper into the hollow, but this time we're going to be prepared. If the light is tied to something ancient, something that's been here for centuries, there's got to be a center, a heart of it. And we need to find it. You're assuming there's a way to stop it, Josiah said. What if there isn't? Then at least we'll know the truth, Eleanor said. Isn't that why you became a reporter? Josiah gave her a look but didn't argue further. Instead, he nodded. Fine, but if we're doing this, we're doing it right. Supplies, gear, a way to mark our path so we don't get lost. Eleanor smiled faintly, grateful for his reluctant resolve. Agreed. We leave at first light tomorrow. The rest of the day was spent gathering what they needed. Eleanor raided the library one last time, combing through every old map and record she could find. Most of the maps were crude, hand-drawn sketches that labeled the hollow as nothing more than unexplored or forbidden. But one stood out, a tattered piece of parchment dating back to the 19th century. It depicted the hollow as a series of concentric circles, with an ominous marking in the center labeled, "The Lantern's Rest." Eleanor traced the faded ink with her finger, her heart pounding. This was it, the heart of the hollow. Josiah, meanwhile, raided the general store for supplies. Flashlights, batteries, ropes, and even a handheld GPS. Though he doubted it would work in the hollow, he wasn't about to take any chances. He also bought a small hunting rifle, earning a disapproving glance from the store clerk. You planning on going into the woods? The clerk asked, her voice tinged with concern. Something like that, Josiah muttered. You shouldn't, the clerk said, her tone dropping. Not at night. Not ever. Josiah didn't respond. He left with his supplies, the clerk's words echoing in his mind. By the time evening fell, they were ready. Eleanor sat in her cabin, carefully packing her bag and staring at the map. She couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would be a turning point, not just for her research, but for her entire life. She barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the light, the figure inside it, and the hollow eyes that had stared into her soul. Dawn came too soon, pale and cold. Eleanor and Josiah met at the edge of the forest, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. Neither of them spoke as they adjusted their packs and stepped into the woods. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful, but the further they went, the more the atmosphere began to change. The trees grew taller and closer together, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew thick, damp, and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that made Eleanor's stomach turn. They followed the map as best they could, using landmarks and markings on the trees to guide their way. But the deeper they went, the harder it became to orient themselves. The forest seemed to shift around them, its paths winding and doubling back in ways that defied logic. I don't like this, Josiah said, his voice tight. It feels like the woods are alive. They might be, Eleanor replied, glancing over her shoulder. She could feel the weight of the hollow pressing down on her, as if the forest itself were watching their every move. By midday, they reached a small clearing, the first they'd seen in hours. In the center of the clearing was an ancient oak tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled, with thick roots that jutted out of the ground like the legs of some enormous creature. Eleanor approached the tree cautiously, her eyes scanning its surface. Carved into the bark were dozens of symbols, spirals, circles, and shapes she didn't recognize. At the base of the tree, half buried in the dirt, was something shiny. She knelt down and brushed away the soil, revealing a rusted lantern. This is it, she whispered, her voice trembling. This is the Lantern's Rest. Before Josiah could respond, the air around them grew cold, bone-chillingly cold. The light appeared again, flickering at the edge of the clearing. But this time it didn't stay still. It began to move toward them, faster and more deliberate than before. Eleanor and Josiah backed away, their hearts pounding as the light grew brighter. The hum returned, louder than ever, vibrating through the ground and into their very bones. The figure within the light became visible, its skeletal frame towering over them. "It's here," Josiah said, his voice barely audible. Eleanor's hand tightened around the rusted lantern as the light surged forward, engulfing them both in its fiery glow. The light surged, blinding and hot, swallowing Eleanor and Josiah whole. Eleanor braced herself, expecting pain or some kind of impact, but instead, there was only weightlessness, like falling through water. The world around her dissolved into a kaleidoscope of shifting colors, shadows, and sounds, each one pulling her deeper into the unknown. She tried to speak, to call out to Josiah, but her voice was lost in the deafening hum that now filled her ears. The sensation was overwhelming. Every nerve in her body felt stretched taut, as if the light itself were probing her, peeling away layers of her consciousness. Images flickered in her mind. Faces she didn't recognize, places she'd never been, and memories that weren't her own. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the light receded. Eleanor landed hard on the ground, the impact jarring her back to reality. She gasped, her lungs burning as if she'd been holding her breath for hours. Around her, the air was still and thick with a strange, acrid smell. "Josiah!" she croaked, her voice raw. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she searched the clearing. He was lying a few feet away, his face pale and his eyes half open. For a horrifying moment, she thought he was dead, but then he groaned and rolled onto his side. "I'm here," he muttered, his voice barely audible. What just happened?" "I don't know," Eleanor said, rushing to his side. "Are you okay? Can you move?" He nodded weakly, sitting up with her help. "I think so. What about you?" "I'm fine," she said, though she wasn't sure it was true. Her hands were trembling, and her head was spinning with fragmented images and sensations she couldn't explain. She turned her attention back to their surroundings. The clearing was still there, but it had changed. The ancient oak tree was gone, replaced by a charred stump that oozed black sap. The ground was scorched and cracked, and the air was suffused with an unnatural glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere. "What is this place?" Josiah asked, his voice trembling. "Are we still in the hollow?" Eleanor didn't answer. Her eyes were drawn to the rusted lantern she still clutched in her hands. It felt heavier now, as if something inside it had awakened. The metal was warm to the touch, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. "I think we've crossed into something else," she said finally. "Another layer of the hollow, or maybe something deeper." Josiah looked around, his face pale. "This isn't natural. We need to get out of here." Eleanor nodded, but she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The lantern's rest wasn't just a place. It was a threshold, a gateway to whatever force had been haunting the hollow for centuries. They had crossed that threshold, and she doubted they would be allowed to leave without confronting what lay ahead. A sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Eleanor froze, her grip tightening on the lantern. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of footsteps on the brittle ground. "Do you see it?" Josiah whispered, his voice barely audible. Eleanor shook her head, her eyes darting between the shadows. The light had disappeared, but she could feel its presence, watching them from the periphery of her vision. And then, slowly, something emerged from the darkness. It wasn't the figure they had seen in the light before. This was different, larger, more solid, and infinitely more terrifying. Its body was a twisted amalgamation of bone and shadow, its limbs impossibly long and ending in jagged claws that scraped the ground as it moved. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a void, a gaping absence that seemed to pull in the light around it. Eleanor and Josiah backed away instinctively, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. The creature tilted its head, as if studying them, and then let out a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a scream. The noise tore through Eleanor's skull, making her stagger and clutch her head. "It's not going to let us leave," Josiah said, his voice tight with panic. Eleanor forced herself to focus, her eyes darting to the lantern in her hands. If the lantern man, or whatever this creature was, had brought them here, then maybe the lantern itself was the key to escaping. "Cover me," she said, her voice trembling. "I think this lantern is connected to it. Maybe I can use it." "Are you kidding me?" Josiah hissed. "How do you even know what it does?" "I don't," Eleanor admitted. "But it's better than standing here and waiting to die." Before Josiah could argue, she stepped forward, holding the lantern out in front of her. The creature stopped, its head snapping toward her with a suddenness that made her heart lurch. It let out another guttural sound, this one lower and more resonant, as if it were responding to the lantern's presence. Eleanor took a deep breath and turned the small knob on the side of the lantern. The wick inside ignited instantly, casting a golden glow that seemed impossibly bright against the oppressive darkness. The creature recoiled, its body writhing as if in pain. The light from the lantern expanded, pushing back the shadows and revealing more of the scorched landscape. "Keep going," Josiah shouted, pulling out the rifle he'd brought. He fired a shot into the darkness, the sound echoing unnaturally, but the creature didn't flinch. His focus was entirely on the lantern. Eleanor twisted the knob further, the light growing brighter and more intense. The lantern began to hum, vibrating in her hands as if it were alive. The creature let out a keening wail, its body dissolving at the edges, the shadows peeling away like smoke caught in a strong wind. The hum of the lantern grew louder, drowning out everything else. Eleanor's vision blurred, the edges of the world dissolving into golden light. The last thing she saw before everything went white was the creature collapsing into a heap of ash, its scream fading into silence. When Eleanor opened her eyes, she was lying on the forest floor. The sunlight filtered through the trees above, warm and golden, and the air was filled with the sound of birdsong. She sat up slowly, her body aching as if she'd been dropped from a great height. Josiah was beside her, unconscious but breathing. The lantern lay between them, its glow extinguished, looking like nothing more than an ordinary, rusted relic. They had made it out. But as Eleanor stared at the lantern, a chill ran through her. The light might have saved them, but it hadn't been destroyed. Whatever force had brought them into the hollow still lingered, waiting for the next fool to stumble into its grasp. Eleanor knew one thing for certain. The stories of Meadow Hollow weren't over, and neither was the lantern man. Eleanor sat there in the forest clearing, the weight of the lantern heavy in her hands. The sunlight filtering through the trees seemed almost too bright, a sharp contrast to the oppressive darkness they had just escaped. Josiah groaned beside her, stirring slowly as he came back to consciousness. She placed a hand on his shoulder to steady him, her voice soft but urgent. "Josiah, we're out," she said. "We made it." He blinked, his face pale and his eyes glassy as he looked around. "We're back? How?" Eleanor held up the lantern. "This brought us out. Somehow it's connected to whatever we saw in there." Josiah pushed himself into a sitting position, staring at the rusted object in her hands. "That thing? It almost got us killed. But it also saved us," Eleanor countered. "The light, whatever it is, reacted to it. And the creature, it couldn't withstand it." Josiah shook his head, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. "I don't care what it did. We shouldn't have survived that. None of this makes sense. We should leave this place and never look back." Eleanor was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the lantern. It was no longer glowing, no longer pulsing with life, but she could feel its power still there, dormant but waiting. She thought about all the stories she'd heard, all the warnings she'd ignored. The lantern man, the cursed hollow, the figures in the light. They weren't just legends. They were real, and they were still out there. "I can't leave yet," she said finally, her voice firm. Josiah turned to her, disbelief etched into his face. "What do you mean you can't leave? We barely made it out alive. That thing in there, it wasn't just a story. It wasn't just folklore. It's real, and it's dangerous." "That's exactly why I can't leave," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze. "If we don't figure out what this is, someone else is going to stumble into the hollow. Someone else is going to die. Don't you see?" We have the lantern. This is our chance to understand what's been haunting this town for centuries." Josiah looked at her like she'd gone mad. "You don't get it, do you? That thing doesn't want to be understood. It doesn't care about your research, Eleanor. It doesn't care about anything except drawing people in and destroying them." "Maybe," Eleanor said, "but maybe it's more than that. What if the lantern is the key to ending it? What if there's something in the hollow we haven't seen yet? Something that could stop this once and for all?" Josiah stood, his movements sharp and angry. "You don't know that. And I'm not going back in there just so you can write another page in your notebook." Eleanor stood as well, clutching the lantern tightly. "I'm not asking you to. You've done more than enough, and I don't blame you for wanting to leave. But I can't walk away from this. I have to go back." Josiah stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. "You're insane," he said finally. "You know that, right?" "Maybe," she admitted. "But you've seen what's in there. You know I'm right." He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked a few steps away, his hands on his hips as he stared into the trees. Eleanor could see the conflict in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed as if he were fighting an internal battle. Finally, he let out a long sigh and turned back to her. "If you're going back, you're not going alone." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Josiah, don't thank me," he said sharply. "I'm not doing this because I think it's a good idea. I'm doing it because I don't trust you not to get yourself killed. Someone has to keep you alive long enough to figure out whatever the hell this is." Eleanor nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thank you." He rolled his eyes. Yeah, let's just take a minute. I need to catch my breath before I do something else I'll regret." They sat in silence for a while, the forest around them eerily quiet. The birdsong had returned, but it felt distant, as if the hollow were still watching, still waiting. Eleanor studied the lantern in her lap, her mind racing with possibilities. What was it, really? A tool? A weapon? Or something else entirely? As they rested, she pulled out her notebook and began to write, sketching the symbols she'd seen carved into the trees and recording every detail she could remember about the light and the creature. Josiah watched her for a moment before speaking. "So, what's the plan this time?" he asked. "Walk back in and hope the lantern saves us again?" "No," Eleanor said. "We need to go deeper. There's something at the heart of the hollow, something the lantern is tied to. If we can find it, maybe we can put an end to all of this." "And if we can't?" Josiah asked, his voice low. Eleanor looked up at him, her expression resolute. "Then at least we'll know we tried." The sun was beginning to set by the time they stood and began walking back toward the hollow. The golden light of late afternoon filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. This time, their steps were slower, more deliberate. They marked their path with strips of cloth tied to branches, ensuring they wouldn't get lost in the maze of the woods. As the light faded, the atmosphere around them began to change. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sky. The air grew heavy, and the faint hum they'd heard before returned, vibrating just below the surface of perception. Eleanor held the lantern tightly, her fingers brushing over its rusted surface. She could feel its warmth growing, a subtle pulse that matched the rhythm of her heartbeat. Whatever lay ahead, the lantern would lead them to it. The hum grew louder as they pressed deeper into the hollow, the forest around them becoming a blur of shadow and movement. Eleanor's grip tightened on the lantern, its light flickering to life as if responding to the growing tension. Josiah stayed close behind her, his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. And then, suddenly, the forest opened up before them. They stepped into a massive clearing, the air thick with the smell of ash and decay. At the center of the clearing stood an enormous stone altar, its surface carved with symbols that glowed faintly in the lantern's light. Surrounding the altar were dozens of figures, statues of twisted, skeletal forms frozen in poses of agony and despair. "This is it," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "The heart of the hollow." Before Josiah could respond, the hum reached a deafening pitch, and the light from the lantern flared. The clearing was bathed in its golden glow, and the shadows around them began to shift, coalescing into a familiar form. The lantern man had returned. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its skeletal frame towering over them, its eyes burning with an unnatural fire. The air around it crackled with energy, and Eleanor could feel its gaze piercing into her very soul. "What do we do?" Josiah asked, his voice barely audible. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands steady as she raised the lantern. "We finish this." The light from the lantern grew brighter, its warmth spreading through her as she stepped toward the altar. The lantern man let out a guttural roar, its form writhing as it lunged toward her. But Eleanor didn't stop. She placed the lantern on the altar, its light merging with the glowing symbols. The ground beneath them shook, and the lantern man let out a scream that echoed through the hollow. Its body dissolved into shadow, drawn into the light of the lantern as the symbols on the altar flared to life. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the light vanished. The hollow was silent. Eleanor and Josiah stood in the clearing, the lantern cold and lifeless on the altar. The statues were gone, and the oppressive weight of the forest had lifted. The hollow was just a forest now, dark, quiet, and still. They had done it. The lantern man was gone. As they made their way back to the edge of the hollow, Eleanor felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The stories of Meadow Hollow had come to an end, but the cost was heavy. The lantern had taken the darkness with it, but it had also taken something from her, something she couldn't quite name. For the first time in her career, Eleanor felt the weight of the stories she had sought to uncover. They weren't just tales to be recorded. They were lives, histories, and warnings. And some stories, she realized, were meant to stay buried. Eleanor and Josiah emerged from the hollow as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. The forest behind them was eerily silent, as if the land itself had fallen into a deep sleep after what had transpired. They stopped at the edge of the tree-line, their faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion, their bodies aching from the ordeal. Neither of them spoke at first, the weight of what they had just experienced settling over them like a heavy fog. The hollow was behind them now, but its presence lingered in their minds, a shadow that neither light nor distance could fully banish. Josiah finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "So what now?" Eleanor turned to him, the rusted lantern dangling loosely from her hand. Its once vibrant glow was gone, leaving behind nothing but cold metal and the faint residue of its strange power. She stared at it for a long moment before answering. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know what happens now." Josiah let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "We just face down, whatever the hell that was, and all you've got is, I don't know?" Eleanor looked away, her gaze drifting back to the forest. "What do you want me to say? That it's over? That the hollow is safe now? I don't even know if that's true." Josiah's shoulders sagged, and he sank to the ground, sitting cross-legged in the grass. "It felt different in there at the end," he said. "Lighter, I guess, like we did something. Do you think we stopped it?" "I think we stopped something," Eleanor said carefully. "The lantern man, the creature, it's gone. I felt it leave. But the hollow, I don't think it'll ever be safe. There's too much history here, too much pain." "Then what was the point?" Josiah muttered, his tone bitter. "If it's still dangerous, if it's still out there waiting for someone else, what did we even accomplish?" Eleanor sat beside him, cradling the lantern in her lap. "We gave it a story," she said quietly. "One with an ending, and maybe that's enough for now." Josiah frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. "You think people will believe us?" "Some will," she said. "Some won't. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that we know the truth, and we can warn people. Maybe we can stop someone else from going through what we did." He let out a long sigh, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I guess that's something." They sat in silence for a while, the soft rustle of the wind the only sound. The hollow loomed behind them, its secrets buried for now. Eleanor knew she could never erase what she'd seen, what she'd felt, but she also knew she couldn't live in its shadow forever. There were other stories to uncover, other mysteries to explore. But as she looked down at the lantern in her hands, she felt a pang of uncertainty. The object was dormant now, its purpose seemingly fulfilled. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly empty. The hollow's light had been extinguished, but its echoes lingered, faint and distant, like a song she couldn't quite hear. "What are you going to do with that thing?" Josiah asked, nodding toward the lantern. "I don't know," Eleanor said honestly. "I thought about leaving it here, but I don't think I can." "Why not?" She hesitated, her fingers brushing over the cold metal. "Because I think it's still connected to the hollow. If I leave it here, someone might find it. Someone who doesn't understand what it is." Josiah gave her a skeptical look. "And you do?" "No," she admitted with a faint smile. "But I'm willing to learn." He shook his head, a wry grin tugging at his lips. "You're one stubborn woman, Eleanor." "I've been called worse," she said lightly, though her voice carried a note of sadness. They stood after a while, their bodies stiff from sitting too long. The morning sun was climbing higher, its warmth chasing away the lingering chill. As they made their way back toward Meadow Hollow, Eleanor felt the weight of the lantern grow heavier in her hand. Not physically, but emotionally. It was a reminder of everything they'd faced, everything they'd lost and gained. The town was just beginning to stir when they arrived. People peeked out from their windows, their expressions wary as they watched Eleanor and Josiah walk through the quiet streets. Word had spread, she realized. The townsfolk knew where they had been, and they knew what it meant. Maggie was waiting for them on her porch, her sharp eyes narrowing as they approached. "You're back," she said, her tone neutral. "I wasn't sure you would be." "We're back," Eleanor said, stopping at the base of the steps. "It's done. The lantern man is gone." Maggie studied her for a long moment, her gaze flicking to the lantern in Eleanor's hand. "Is it?" she asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, though the certainty in her voice wavered. "It's gone. The hollow's different now." Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line. "Different isn't the same as safe." "I know," Eleanor said, "but it's a start." Maggie gave a slow nod, her expression softening. "You did something most people wouldn't dare to. You faced the hollow and lived to tell the tale. That's no small thing." Eleanor didn't respond. She wasn't sure what to say. Instead, she held up the lantern. "What do you know about this?" she asked. "The lantern, what it is, where it came from." Maggie's eyes lingered on the object, and for the first time, Eleanor saw something like fear in her expression. "It's older than this town," Maggie said finally. "Older than any of us. Whatever power it holds, it's tied to the hollow. If you've got it now, you'd best be careful with it. Things like that don't let go so easily." Eleanor nodded, her grip tightening on the lantern. "I'll be careful." Maggie didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned and walked back into her house, leaving Eleanor and Josiah alone on the street. "You're not done, are you?" Josiah asked after a moment. Eleanor shook her head. "No, this is just the beginning." Josiah sighed, a tired but knowing smile on his face. "Figures. You've got a death wish." "Maybe," she said with a faint grin. "But it's a story worth chasing." With that, they walked away from the porch, the lantern swinging gently in Eleanor's hand. The hollow might have been behind them, but its shadow stretched long, following them into the unknown. And somewhere deep in the woods, the silence broke, replaced by the faintest flicker of light. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed in her rented cabin, the lantern resting on the floor beside her. The room was dark except for the faint gray light filtering through the curtains, but she didn't need much to see. Her eyes were fixed on the lantern, her thoughts spiraling through the events of the past few days. She had thought this trip would be like her others, documenting folklore, interviewing locals, and unearthing the roots of old stories. She had come here as an outsider, curious but detached, hoping to capture Meadow Hollow's secrets in the pages of her notebook. Now, she wasn't sure if she would ever leave this place behind. The lantern had changed everything. Holding it now, Eleanor couldn't deny its weight, Not just the physical heft of its rusted frame, but the power it seemed to radiate. Even in its dormant state, it felt alive, as though it was watching her, waiting for her next move. It wasn't just a relic. It was a piece of the hollow, something born from the same darkness that had swallowed the forest for centuries. A knock at the door startled her out of her thoughts. She glanced toward it, her heart quickening, before forcing herself to stand and cross the room. When she opened the door, she found Josiah standing on the porch, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. His face was still pale, his exhaustion clear, but his eyes were steady. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head, stepping aside to let him in. "Not after that." He entered without a word, his gaze immediately falling on the lantern. He frowned, then looked at her. "You're really keeping that thing?" "I don't think I have a choice," Eleanor said. She shut the door and leaned against it, crossing her arms. "It's tied to me now, to us." Josiah let out a humorless laugh. "I didn't sign up for that." "You didn't sign up for any of this," Eleanor said quietly. "And yet, here we are." Josiah sat down in the chair by the window, his shoulders slumping. "What happens now?" he asked. "Do we just pretend it's over? Write a report and hope no one else goes near the hollow?" Eleanor hesitated. She had asked herself the same question a dozen times since they'd left the forest. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think the hollow is quieter now. Whatever we did, it worked. At least for now." "For now," Josiah echoed. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You think it'll come back?" Eleanor glanced at the lantern, her stomach twisting. "I don't know," she said again. "But the hollow, it's been there for centuries. It's more than just a place. It's a wound, and wounds don't heal overnight." Josiah was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "You're not going to leave this alone, are you?" Eleanor gave him a faint smile. "Would you?" He sighed. "No, I guess not." But as she looked down at the lantern in her hands, she felt a pang of uncertainty. The object was dormant now, its purpose seemingly fulfilled. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly empty. The hollow's light had been extinguished, but its echoes lingered, faint and distant, like a song she couldn't quite hear. "What are you going to do with that thing?" Josiah asked, nodding toward the lantern. "I don't know," Eleanor said honestly. "I thought about leaving it here, but I don't think I can." "Why not?" She hesitated, her fingers brushing over the cold metal. "Because I think it's still connected to the hollow. If I leave it here, someone might find it. Someone who doesn't understand what it is." Josiah gave her a skeptical look. "And you do?" "No," she admitted with a faint smile. "But I'm willing to learn." He shook his head, a wry grin tugging at his lips. "You're one stubborn woman, Eleanor." "I've been called worse," she said lightly, though her voice carried a note of sadness. They stood after a while, their bodies stiff from sitting too long. The morning sun was climbing higher, its warmth chasing away the lingering chill. As they made their way back toward Meadow Hollow, Eleanor felt the weight of the lantern grow heavier in her hand. Not physically, but emotionally. It was a reminder of everything they'd faced, everything they'd lost and gained. The town was just beginning to stir when they arrived. People peeked out from their windows, their expressions wary as they watched Eleanor and Josiah walk through the quiet streets. Word had spread, she realized. The townsfolk knew where they had been, and they knew what it meant. Maggie was waiting for them on her porch, her sharp eyes narrowing as they approached. "You're back," she said, her tone neutral. "I wasn't sure you would be." "We're back," Eleanor said, stopping at the base of the steps. "It's done. The lantern man is gone." Maggie studied her for a long moment, her gaze flicking to the lantern in Eleanor's hand. "Is it?" she asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, though the certainty in her voice wavered. "It's gone. The hollow's different now." Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line. "Different isn't the same as safe." "I know," Eleanor said, "but it's a start." Maggie gave a slow nod, her expression softening. "You did something most people wouldn't dare to. You faced the hollow and lived to tell the tale. That's no small thing. Eleanor didn't respond. She wasn't sure what to say. Instead, she held up the lantern. "What do you know about this?" she asked. The lantern, what it is, where it came from. Maggie's eyes lingered on the object, and for the first time, Eleanor saw something like fear in her expression. "It's older than this town," Maggie said finally. "Older than any of us. Whatever power it holds, it's tied to the hollow. If you've got it now, you'd best be careful with it. Things like that don't let go so easily." She didn't step into the woods. Not yet. Instead, she stood there, staring into the shadows, and made a silent promise to herself. She would stay in Meadow Hollow. She would protect its stories, its people, and its secrets. And she would be ready when the darkness returned. Because she knew it would. The hollow wasn't finished with her yet, and neither was the lantern. The weeks after Josiah's departure were quiet, but the kind of quiet that carried weight. Meadow Hollow settled back into its usual rhythms, its people seemingly content to let the darkness of the hollow fade into memory. For Eleanor, however, the silence was a constant reminder of the truth that still lingered in the woods. She could feel it in the way the trees seemed to sway a little too deliberately, in the whispers of wind that carried through the town at night. She kept the lantern on the small desk in her cabin. It hadn't stirred since the day they left the hollow, but she couldn't bring herself to put it away. The rusted frame and dulled glass were more than a relic. They were a reminder of what lay beneath the surface of the world. Sometimes she would sit and stare at it, her mind wandering to the moment when it had flared with life, pulsing with a power she still didn't understand. But life had to go on even in the shadow of such things. Eleanor found herself spending more time with Maggie, poring over the older woman's stories and piecing together the fragments of Meadow Hollow's history. Maggie had been reluctant at first, but Eleanor's persistence wore her down, and eventually, she began to share the deeper, darker tales. "They'll always call it the Lantern Man," Maggie said one afternoon, her voice rasping with age. "But it wasn't a man, you know. Never was. That light's older than these mountains, older than any of us. It's been here since before the first people settled this land." "Then why did it stop?" Eleanor asked, her notebook open on her lap. "What made it retreat when we used the lantern?" Maggie gave her a long, knowing look. "You didn't stop it," she said. "You just gave it pause. It's patient, that thing. It'll wait, and it'll watch, and one day, when it's ready, it'll come back." Eleanor wanted to protest, to believe they had done more than just delay the inevitable. But she couldn't. Deep down, she had always known Maggie was right. The lantern had been a tool, maybe even a weapon, but it hadn't destroyed the hollow's power. It had only quieted it. Still, Eleanor found solace in the work. She began cataloging everything she had learned, filling notebook after notebook with the history of the hollow, the stories of its victims, and the strange patterns that seemed to ripple through time. She sent copies to her university, careful to leave out the details that would raise too many questions. The townsfolk might have accepted her presence, but she knew they wouldn't forgive her if outsiders began poking around in their secrets. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened outside her cabin, Eleanor lit a small candle and sat down at her desk. The lantern sat before her, its surface catching the flickering light. She opened a fresh notebook, its pages crisp and clean, and began to write. The Hollow and the Lantern Man, a study in folklore and reality. The first documented accounts of the hollow date back to the early 1700s, when settlers began to report strange lights in the woods and unexplained disappearances. These stories, passed down through generations, evolved into the legend of the Lantern Man, a figure said to lure victims into the forest with its ghostly glow. She paused, tapping the pen against her chin. It felt strange to write about the hollow as if it were just a story, as if she hadn't seen its darkness firsthand. But she knew this was the only way to preserve what she had learned. The world outside Meadow Hollow would never believe the truth, but they might believe a legend. A knock at the door startled her, breaking her concentration. Eleanor frowned, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was late, too late for visitors. She stood slowly, her heart quickening as she moved toward the door. When she opened it, there was no one there. The porch was empty, the clearing around her cabin bathed in the dim glow of moonlight. She stepped outside, her eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. And then she saw it, a faint flicker of light, deep in the woods. It was small, barely more than a pinprick, but it was unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at it, the memory of that terrible glow flooding her mind. The light didn't move, didn't grow brighter or dimmer, simply hovered there, waiting. Eleanor clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. She had known this moment would come. The hollow wasn't done with her, and she wasn't done with it. She turned back to the cabin, grabbing her jacket and slipping the lantern into her pack. As she stepped off the porch and into the woods, she felt the familiar pull of the hollow calling her back. But this time she wasn't afraid. This time she was ready. The trees closed around her, the light guiding her deeper into the shadows. And though the darkness pressed in from all sides, Eleanor carried the lantern with her, its weight both a burden and a promise. The story wasn't over. Not yet, and neither was she.